That Father's Day, the Harlow house smelled like roasted lamb, garlic butter rolls, and expensive red wine. My father, Richard Harlow, stood at the head of the table, perfectly tailored navy suit, polished shoes, a man who loved the performance of power almost as much as the power itself. He tapped his glass, raised it high, and with that smug half-smile he'd perfected over decades, he announced, "To my children, the ones who carry the Harlow name with pride, you make me honored to be your father every single day." The table erupted in applause and laughter. My siblings, Claire, the golden daughter who became a corporate lawyer at 26, and Andrew, the prodigy son working in finance, both beamed under his praise. My mother dabbed her eyes with a silk napkin as if she'd just heard poetry. And me? I sat at the far end, half hidden in the shadows. My glass of water remained untouched, my plate mostly cold. No one looked at me, no one toasted me. I wasn't included in his children. I never was. Growing up, I used to wonder what I had done wrong. Was I too quiet, too average, too different? But eventually, the answer settled in me like rot. I wasn't wanted. Not really. So, like every other family gathering, I sat silent, watching, enduring. But that night, the script didn't go the way my father had written it. Because just as my brother raised his glass to add another self-congratulatory speech, the front door slammed open. The sound cracked through the house like a gunshot. Everyone turned. And there he was, a man in his late 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, his suit torn at the arm, blood trailing from a cut above his eyebrow. His eyes burned with purpose, scanning the room, ignoring every shocked face until they locked on me. Without hesitation, he walked forward. The room fell silent except for the click of his shoes on the marble floor. When he stopped in front of me, he placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "This is my son," he said, his voice deep, steady, undeniable. My father's face drained of color. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came. Claire's fork clattered against her plate, and Andrew nearly knocked over his wine glass. And me? I froze. My heart thundered in my chest as if trying to break free. Then the man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were creased, the surface smeared faintly with blood and rain. He pressed it into my hands. "Read it," he said. The room leaned closer. And in that moment, with that piece of paper burning in my palm, I knew nothing about my life would ever be the same again. The room felt frozen, the kind of silence that makes even the air feel heavy, pressing down on your chest until every breath hurts. My fingers tightened around the paper he'd shoved into my palm. It wasn't just paper, it felt heavier, as though it carried the weight of every lie, every scar, every truth I'd been denied my whole life. I didn't open it. I couldn't, not yet. Across the table, my father's hand trembled against his wine glass. He masked it quickly, clearing his throat, forcing that deep, commanding voice he always used when he wanted to control a room. "Who are you?" Richard Harlow demanded, each word sharp, like he was cutting the man out of existence with his tone alone. The stranger's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching as though holding back years of rage. He didn't look at my father. His gaze stayed locked on me. "Mason knows," he said. Except I didn't, not yet. Claire's laugh broke the tension, high-pitched, almost desperate. "This is ridiculous. Some lunatic walks into our house bleeding and claims to be what? Family." She looked at me then, her eyes narrowed like knives. "Mason, do you know this man?" Her question cut me deeper than it should have, because even she assumed the obvious answer was no. But something in me hesitated. Some part of me, buried beneath years of dismissal, whispered yes. Because while I didn't know his name, his face, or his story, there was something familiar in the way he looked at me. Not pity, not disgust, not the cold indifference I'd grown up with, but recognition. I glanced down at the paper still trembling in my hand. The edges were damp with blood and rain. My name was written on the outside in thick, rushed letters. "Mason," the man said again, softer this time, almost botherly. "Go on, read it." But before I could, Richard slammed his hand on the table. The wine glass shattered, red spilling across the white tablecloth like blood blooming in snow. "You don't belong here," my father barked, pointing a shaking finger at the stranger. "Get out of my house before I have you dragged out." The man didn't flinch, didn't move. He just stared at my father with a look I'd never seen before. Not hatred, not fear, but the calm certainty of someone who knew the game was already over. "You've lied long enough, Richard," he said. "Tonight it ends." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. My heart pounded as I looked between the two men. The man who had raised me but never loved me, and the stranger who had just walked into our home, bloodied and defiant, claiming me as his son. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to open the paper and finally know the truth. But before I could move, my mother spoke for the first time that night. Her voice was low, trembling, but filled with something I'd never heard from her before. Fear. "Richard," she whispered, "he knows." The stranger turned his gaze to her for the first time, and in that fleeting second, I saw it. History, recognition, secrets. And then it hit me like a thunderbolt. Whoever this man was, my mother knew him. Knew him well. The paper in my hand suddenly felt like a lit fuse, ready to explode everything I thought I knew about my family, my life, myself. And as I unfolded it with shaking hands, the first line made my knees go weak. The paper crackled as I unfolded it, every crease stiff with dried rain and smeared blood. My eyes raced across the words, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't typed. It wasn't formal. It was handwritten in a hurried scrawl, the ink blotted in places where the pen must have pressed too hard. "Mason, if you are reading this, it means the truth can no longer be buried. You are my son." The room spun. I blinked once, twice. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the letter. "My son? No, impossible." The man's voice cut through my thoughts. Steady, deliberate, almost daring me to doubt him. "Keep reading." My chest tightened as my eyes moved down the page. "Your mother and I met long before Richard came into the picture. He knew you were mine. He took everything from me. My company, my reputation, my family. But he couldn't take you. Not completely. You've always been mine." I froze, my gaze snapping to my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her hands were clutched in her lap, white-knuckled, her shoulders trembling. "Mom!" My voice cracked, more broken plea than question. "Is this true?" She didn't answer. Instead, Richard shot to his feet, his face red with rage. "Don't listen to him, Mason. He's nothing. He's a liar. A parasite who's trying to destroy everything I've built." But the stranger, my supposed father, didn't back down. His lips curved in the faintest smile. "Everything you built? Richard, you've been living off what wasn't yours for nearly 3 decades. The empire? The money? The life of luxury? None of it belongs to you. And deep down, you know it." The table rattled as Richard slammed his fist down. "Get out!" he roared. But I barely heard him. My mind was unraveling, the letter's words searing themselves into my soul. "One day you'll understand why I couldn't protect you. Why I had to stay in the shadows. But the moment will come when you'll have to choose to live under his lies or reclaim what is rightfully yours. Reclaim. Rightfully mine." The words echoed like a drumbeat in my skull. I stared at Richard, the man who'd raised me, lectured me, shamed me, dismissed me my entire life. The man who had never once called me son without a sneer attached to it. And then I looked back at the stranger, battered and bloodied, but standing tall in the middle of our dining room, like a storm no one could stop. My pulse roared in my ears. Everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, my place in the world, was slipping through my fingers. The paper slid from my trembling hand and floated to the floor. Richard's eyes followed it, wild and desperate, before snapping back to me. "Don't you dare believe a word of this, Mason," he hissed. "He's manipulating you. He always has. But that was the thing. Always. If there was no truth to any of this, why did my mother sit there in silence, her head bowed, tears streaking her face? Why did she look more guilty than I had ever seen her in my life? And why, in my gut, did something about the stranger's words feel right?" He stepped closer, his voice calm now, almost gentle. "You've always wondered why he treated you differently, haven't you? Why nothing you ever did was enough. Why every achievement was met with silence, every mistake punished twice as hard. It wasn't because of you, Mason. It was because every time he looked at you, he saw me." The words hit me like a hammer. I thought back to every cold stare, every dismissive remark, every slammed door. The years of trying, failing, trying again, only to be told I'd never measure up. And for the first time in my life, it all made sense. I staggered back, the walls closing in, the taste of bile rising in my throat. Richard lunged across the table, his voice shaking with something that wasn't just rage. It was fear. "Don't you dare listen to him," he roared. "He doesn't love you, Mason. He never has. He just wants to use you, like he's always used everyone." But the stranger didn't flinch. He just looked at me, his eyes steady, unwavering. "Mason," he said, his voice low but unbreakable, "you're not his blood. You're mine. The room erupted. My mother gasped. Richard's face contorted in fury. My siblings shouted over one another, their voices a blur. And me? I stood there frozen. The weight of two lives crashing down on me at once. The one I had lived, and the one that had been stolen. But before I could speak, before I could demand the truth from my mother, the stranger reached into his jacket with a blood-stained hand and pulled out another envelope. He slid it across the table toward me. "This," he said, his eyes never leaving mine, "will prove everything." And that was when Richard lunged at him. The room shattered into chaos. Chairs scraped back against polished hardwood. Glass splintered on the floor as Richard lunged across the table, fury exploding from every line of his body. He was a man possessed, a storm unhinged, throwing himself at the bloodied stranger, as though violence could erase the truth that had already cracked open. The stranger stumbled back but didn't falter. He braced himself with one arm against the table, his other still clutching that second envelope, the one that now felt like the ticking heart of a bomb about to detonate. My siblings shrieked. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth, trembling, her eyes darting not at the fight but at me, as if she knew I was about to unravel. I couldn't move. My legs felt cemented to the floor, my heart hammering in my ribs. Richard's fist connected with the stranger's jaw, a sickening crack echoing through the dining room. The man staggered but didn't go down. Instead, he spit blood onto the white tablecloth and looked Richard dead in the eyes. Calm, defiant, unshaken. "You can hit me, Richard," he rasped, his voice iron even through pain. "You can break me, but the truth is already here." Richard roared and swung again. This time, the stranger blocked it, gripping Richard's wrist midair with a strength that startled even me. His voice cut through the chaos, low and steady. "The way you speak when you know the fight has already been won. You built your empire on a lie. And now your children, your family, will know the cost of it." The envelope slipped from his bloodied hand and landed at my feet. Everything slowed, the screams, the scuffle, the pounding in my head. It all blurred as my eyes locked on that envelope. My name was written on it again, Mason, my name, as though it had always belonged to him, not Richard. I bent down, my fingers trembling, my breath shallow. When I picked it up, Richard froze, his fury shifting into something raw, panic. "Don't open that," he barked, his voice breaking with desperation. The stranger gave a grim smile, blood trickling down his chin. "Open it, Mason, you deserve to know." My throat tightened. My eyes burned. I couldn't breathe. But I tore the flap open anyway. The first page was thick, official, documents, notarized, stamped. I scanned the bold header, DNA test results. My knees went weak. The page was dated, recent, the names printed at the top, Mason Harlow, and the stranger. The results stared back at me, undeniable. Probability of paternity, 98%. The paper trembled in my hands. My vision blurred. My entire body felt like it was vibrating out of existence. I wasn't Richard Harlow's son. I was his enemy's. The air was ripped from the room. My siblings fell silent. Even my mother sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands. Richard shook his head, his face a storm of rage and terror. "It's fake," he spat. "He's manipulating you, Mason. Can't you see that? He's always wanted to destroy me, and now he's using you." But the stranger, my real father, straightened, bloodied but resolute, and spoke with a quiet conviction that cut sharper than any scream. "I didn't fake those papers, Richard. And you know it. Because you've always known Mason wasn't yours." He turned his eyes to me then, steady, unwavering, filled with something I had craved my whole life but never received from Richard. "Recognition. You've always felt it, haven't you, Mason?" He asked softly. "That emptiness. That question you couldn't put into words. Why you never belonged. Why no matter what you did, he never looked at you with pride. It's because you were never his. You were mine." The weight of his words crashed over me like an ocean. Memories flashed, years of silence at the dinner table. Richard's cold stares, his dismissive grunts at every accomplishment. The endless nights of asking myself why nothing I did was enough. And suddenly the answer was searingly clear. It was never about me being unworthy. It was about me being his reminder. Richard lunged toward me now, desperation dripping from his every move. "Mason, listen to me. You're my son. I raised you. I put a roof over your head. Don't throw that away for the lies of a broken man." His hands reached for my shoulders, gripping me with the force of a man about to drown. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small under his grip. I stepped back, clutching the papers to my chest, my voice raw but steady. You didn't raise me, Richard. You tolerated me? The words sliced through him like a blade. His face contorted, torn between fury and pain. He shook his head, his voice rising, desperate. Don't you see? He's trying to take everything from me. From us. He doesn't love you, Mason. He just wants to ruin me. But the stranger stepped forward, his eyes never leaving mine. I don't want his money, he said firmly. I don't want his empire. I just want you to know the truth. That you're not unwanted. That you were never the mistake he made you feel like. You are mine, and that will never change. The room was silent again, heavy, suffocating. And then my mother finally spoke. Her voice was soft, broken, but every word was a knife. It's true. The world tilted. Richard turned on her, his face pale, his voice a whisper. No. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she finally looked at me, really. Looked at me, for the first time in years. I tried to protect you, she whispered. I thought it was better this way, safer, but Mason, he's your father. Not Richard. The last thread snapped. Richard's roar shook the walls. He grabbed a candlestick from the table and hurled it at the stranger, but it clattered uselessly against the wall. You've ruined everything, Richard bellowed, his voice guttural, his face crimson. You think you can just walk in here and take him? Take my family? My legacy? The stranger didn't flinch. He wiped the blood from his jaw, straightened his shoulders, and spoke with chilling calm. You stole what was mine decades ago, Richard. But Mason? He was never yours to steal. And now he knows. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. My entire world had been gutted and rebuilt in a single night. The papers in my hand were heavy with truth. But heavier still was the realization that my entire life had been a lie. Richard collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands, muttering to himself, broken. My mother sobbed silently. My siblings stared at me with wide eyes, unsure whether to fear me or pity me. And I stood there, the center of the storm, with two fathers, one by blood, one by name, and the terrifying knowledge that the war between them wasn't over. Because if this was true, if everything the stranger said was real, then the empire Richard had built didn't belong to him at all. It belonged to me, and I wasn't sure if that was salvation or a curse. The silence in that dining room was suffocating. Not a silence of peace, but of destruction. The kind of silence that comes after a bomb has gone off, when the smoke still curls in the air and everyone realizes nothing will ever be the same again. Richard sat slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, his once impenetrable armor shattered. My mother was a trembling mess, whispering apologies that felt 30 years too late. My siblings avoided my eyes, their gazes locked to the table, afraid of what truths might spill if they dared to look at me. And me, I was frozen. My hands still clenched the DNA papers. But it wasn't the ink that weighed them down. It was the knowledge that my blood carried a legacy I had never asked for. Richard finally raised his head. His eyes were red, but not from tears. Richard Harlow didn't cry. They were bloodshot from rage, from watching his carefully constructed kingdom collapse right in front of him. You think this changes anything? His voice was hoarse, guttural. You think one paper, one bloodied stranger can erase decades of work? I built this empire. I bled for it. And you, his finger jabbed toward me, trembling with fury. You are nothing without me. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. A part of me, the boy who had begged for his approval all my life, still wanted to flinch, to bow my head, to stay small. But another part of me, the part that had been awakened tonight, burned hotter than fear. No, I said, my voice quiet but steady. I was nothing because of you. The words hit him harder than any punch. His jaw clenched. His hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles went white. The stranger, my real father, stepped forward, his voice steady despite the blood staining his shirt. It's over, Richard. You know it. Mason knows it. Your family knows it. The lies are done. Richard's lips twisted into a bitter, feral smile. Over? You think this is over? You don't know me. You don't know what I'll do to protect what's mine. And that's when I saw it. That flicker in his eyes, the dangerous glint of a man cornered, a man who'd rather burn his entire empire to ashes than watch it slip from his grasp. My stomach dropped. This wasn't over. This was the beginning. That night I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, the papers still on my nightstand like a ghost staring back at me. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's face, the rage, the desperation, the promise that he wasn't finished. And then I saw my real father's eyes, the quiet strength, the recognition, the wordless plea, don't let him break you anymore. The war had been declared, and I was standing in the middle of it. The days that followed were a blur of tension. Richard tried to act as though nothing had changed. At breakfast, he barked orders about the company as if he still had command. His tone clipped, rehearsed, mechanical. But the household was different. My siblings avoided me, whispering in corners. My mother's apologies hung in the air like a storm cloud. And me, I walked through those halls like a ghost. Every portrait on the wall a reminder that I didn't belong. Until one afternoon a car pulled up the long driveway. My real father stepped out. He wasn't dressed like Richard, no tailored suit, no gold cufflinks. He wore a simple jacket, his face still bruised, but his presence was undeniable. He carried himself like a man who'd spent years in shadows and was finally stepping into the light. Richard exploded when he saw him. "You don't belong here," he roared, his voice echoing through the marble halls. But my father only smiled grimly. "Funny, that's what you told me when you stole my son." The room froze. My siblings' jaws dropped. My mother's face turned pale. And I felt my heart hammering in my chest. Because in that moment it was no longer just about me. This was about legacies. About a 30-year war that had been fought in silence, and now was about to erupt in fire. Richard turned to me then, his voice sharp, cutting, desperate. "You choose now, Mason, him or me." The words hung in the air like a noose. Every eye in the house was on me. My mother's tear-streaked face, my siblings' terrified stares, my father's calm, steady gaze, and Richard shaking with rage, his empire teetering at the edge of collapse. And in that silence I realized something. I wasn't the broken boy anymore. I wasn't the shadow in Richard's house, the son desperate for scraps of approval. I was the heir to the truth, and I was done living in his lie. "I choose the truth," I said finally, my voice steady, ringing through the hall. Richard flinched like I'd struck him. His face twisted, half fury, half heartbreak, and then it hardened into something darker. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You'll regret this. Both of you." He stormed out, his footsteps echoing like thunder, leaving the rest of us in silence. My father placed a hand on my shoulder. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of belonging, not forced, not conditional, but real. And yet, in that moment of fragile clarity, I knew the storm hadn't passed. Richard wasn't retreating. He was regrouping. And when he struck back, it wouldn't just be at me. It would be at everything I loved. Richard Harlow didn't vanish. He retreated. And a man like Richard doesn't retreat without sharpening his knives in the dark. For a few days, the house was quieter. He wasn't at the breakfast table barking orders. His towering presence didn't stalk the halls. But the silence was wrong. It was the kind of silence that made your skin itch. The kind that told you a predator was watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to pounce. I could feel it every time I walked into a room. My siblings were stiff, restless. My mother lingered near the windows, peeking through curtains as if expecting Richard to reappear at any second. And me, I carried those DNA papers everywhere, folded in the inside pocket of my jacket. Proof of who I was, proof of who he wasn't, proof of the war we were now locked in. But proof doesn't protect you. On the third morning after his storming exit, a black Mercedes rolled up the driveway. The driver's door opened and I froze. Richard stepped out. He was dressed as immaculately as ever, dark tailored suit, shoes that gleamed like mirrors, a watch that caught the sunlight and threw it in my eyes. He carried himself like nothing had happened, like the truth hadn't detonated in our dining room, like his entire family hadn't just watched the empire of lies crumble around him. He walked into the house without knocking. His voice carried through the halls as he announced himself, sharp and commanding, as though daring anyone to challenge him. "Family meeting," he barked. "Now." We gathered in the living room. My siblings sat rigid on the couch. My mother hovered near the doorway, wringing her hands. And I stood, arms crossed, heart hammering, waiting. Richard looked at each of us slowly, his eyes cold, his jaw tight. Then he said the words I had been expecting and dreading. "You all seem to think Mason has some claim here. That he has any right to this family, to this fortune. Let me make it very clear, he does not. He is not a Harlow. He is not my son. He has no stake in this house, this company, this family." I clenched my fists, but before I could speak, my real father stepped forward from the corner where he had been quietly waiting. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Richard, stop lying. Everyone here knows the truth now. Richard's lips curled into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. Truth. He laughed bitterly. Truth is whatever people believe. And people believe me, not you. Not him. He jabbed a finger at me. You're nothing but a mistake. Mason, and I'll make sure the world remembers it that way. The words cut deep. They always did. But this time, something inside me shifted. The boy who used to flinch was gone. I wasn't here to beg for his acceptance anymore. You can try, I said quietly. But the truth always finds a way out. You taught me that yourself. Every time you lied, every time you tried to bury me, it only made me stronger. For the first time, Richard faltered. His eyes narrowed, and I saw the rage building beneath his polished mask. You think you can fight me? He hissed. You? With what, a few papers? A broken man who calls himself your father? You have no power, Mason. I built this empire brick by brick. You can't touch me. But he was wrong. Because even as he spoke, the cracks in his empire were spreading. That night after Richard left, my real father sat with me on the porch. The cool night air carried the scent of wet grass, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. You need to be ready, he said. His voice was low, steady, but there was an urgency beneath it. Richard won't stop. Men like him, they don't accept defeat. They don't walk away. He'll come at you, harder than ever. Not just with words, but with everything he has. I swallowed hard. I know. He studied me for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The question is, Mason, are you ready to fight back? The fight didn't take long to arrive. Within a week, rumors began to circulate in town. Ugly whispers about me, claims that I was an imposter, that I was scheming for money, that I was ungrateful, unstable, the kind of poison Richard was a master at spreading. People who had once smiled at me in the market now avoided my eyes. Old friends grew distant, even at the school where I taught. I felt the shift, the quiet conversations that ended when I entered the room, the skeptical looks from parents. Richard was already at work, dismantling me piece by piece. But he underestimated something. For every person he turned against me, there were others who saw through his games. My students, who knew me not as a Harlow or anyone's son, but as the teacher who stayed late to help them, who listened when no one else did. The rancher Harvey, who had given me work when I had nothing, who reminded me that loyalty is worth more than money, and my real father, who stood by me now, ready to rebuild what Richard was trying to burn down. Slowly, painfully, I began to realize Richard didn't own the truth. He didn't own people's loyalty. He didn't own me, and for the first time in my life I felt something new stirring inside me. Power, not the kind that came from money or control or lies, but the power of someone who had been broken and rebuilt, the power of someone who had nothing left to lose. Weeks passed and the battle lines sharpened. Richard launched lawsuits, claiming I was forging documents, that I was attempting to defraud the family. He sent investigators to dig into my past, searching for anything that could be twisted against me. He tried to buy silence, bribe loyalty, poison relationships, but every move he made only exposed him further. The town was watching. The cracks in his reputation widened. The empire he had built so carefully was beginning to shake. And then came the day I decided to strike back. I stood in the office of a lawyer, one of the best in the state. The DNA evidence sat on the table, alongside a thick folder of documents my real father had kept hidden all these years. Proof of Richard's lies, proof of the inheritance he had stolen, proof of the empire built on deception. This, the lawyer said, tapping the folder, is enough to bring him down, not just in court but publicly. If you move forward, Mason, there's no turning back. This will destroy him. I thought of Richard's face, the venom in his voice when he swore I was nothing. I thought of the years I had wasted begging for scraps of love. I thought of my mother's tears, my siblings' silence, the bruises invisible but real. And then I thought of the porch that night, of my real father's steady hand on my shoulder, and the question he had asked me, "Are you ready to fight back?" I looked the lawyer in the eye. "Yes," I said. "It's time." The case was filed. The storm began. News outlets picked it up almost immediately. Heir apparent exposed. Family empire in crisis. DNA scandal shakes Harlow legacy. Cameras swarmed the gates. Journalists hounded every move. Richard raged, of course. He called me a liar, a parasite, a fraud. But every word he spat only made him look smaller. Every denial only dug his hole deeper. And then, like the universe itself had decided enough was enough, the first witnesses stepped forward. Old business partners Richard had betrayed. employees he had crushed, friends he had turned into enemies. Piece by piece, the mighty Richard Harlow was dismantled. And me, I stood taller with every blow he took, because I wasn't fighting to be his son anymore. I was fighting to be my own man. But as the courtroom battles loomed, as the media frenzy built, I knew one thing for certain. Richard wasn't finished. He was cornered, humiliated, desperate. And men like him don't go quietly. The war wasn't over. It was about to reach its most dangerous chapter yet. The courthouse was buzzing like a beehive the morning of the trial. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, each one desperate to capture the downfall of Richard Harlow, the man who had built an empire on lies. And in the center of that chaos I stood, not as Richard's shadow, not as the forgotten son, but as Mason, just Mason. I wore a simple suit, no flashy watch, no designer labels. Just me. My real father stood beside me, his hand briefly squeezing my shoulder before we walked through the heavy oak doors. His quiet strength steadied me more than I could say. Inside, the air was thick, the tension electric. My siblings sat on one side, eyes darting nervously. My mother avoided Richard's gaze, her hands folded tightly in her lap. And then there was Richard himself, seated at the defendant's table. He looked smaller somehow, though his suit was as perfect as always. The lines in his face were deeper. His smile was a mask stretched too thin, but his eyes, they still burned with that same dangerous fire. The fire of a man who refused to lose. When the judge entered and the trial began, the truth came spilling out. One document after another, one witness after another, the DNA results undeniable. The testimonies of employees Richard had crushed, of partners he had betrayed. The paper trail of hidden accounts, stolen inheritances, forged signatures. Piece by piece, the empire he had built collapsed. At first, Richard sneered, scoffed, called it all lies. But as the evidence mounted, his defenses cracked. His voice rose, his composure shattered, until finally, he erupted. "This is all a setup," he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. He pointed at me with trembling fury. "He's nothing. He's not a Harlow. He's a bastard who wants to steal everything I built." The courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to me. My heart pounded, but I stood slowly, deliberately. I looked at Richard, at the man who had tormented me, belittled me, tried to erase me for the last time. "You're right about one thing," I said softly. "I'm not a Harlow, and thank God for that." Gasps rippled through the room. My mother lifted her head, tears glistening in her eyes. My real father sat straighter, pride written across his face. I took a breath and continued, my voice firm, steady. "You've spent your life building walls of lies, Richard. Walls so high you thought no one could climb them. But the truth doesn't need to climb. It breaks through. You taught me I was nothing. You told me I would never matter. But look around you. Look at this courtroom. Look at the empire you swore was untouchable. It's gone, not because of me, because of you. Your greed, your arrogance, your lies. I don't want your name. I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you, because for the first time in my life, I finally understand. I am enough." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's face twisted, red with rage. But there was nothing left for him to say. Nothing left for him to hide behind. His mask was gone, his empire dust. The judge's gavel struck. Guilty, fraud, forgery, embezzlement. The list went on. Richard Harlow, the man who once towered over me like an unshakable giant, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. His shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow, his legacy destroyed. And just like that, the shadow that had haunted me my entire life was gone. When it was over, I walked out of that courthouse into the sunlight. The cameras flashed, the reporters shouted questions, but for the first time I didn't care what anyone said about me. I didn't need their approval. My mother approached me, tears streaming, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Mason, for everything." I nodded. Forgiveness wouldn't be easy, but for the first time it felt possible. Then my real father stepped forward. His eyes met mine, steady, proud. "You did it, son," he said. And hearing that word, son, from him, it was like a weight I'd carried all my life finally lifted. Months later, life was quieter, simpler. I still taught at the high school, still came home to my small apartment at night. But the silence didn't ache anymore. It felt peaceful. My students looked at me with respect, my colleagues with warmth. I wasn't a shadow. I wasn't forgotten. I was just Mason. One evening I sat on that same porch with my real father. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He handed me a glass of iced tea, and for a while, we just sat in silence. Finally, he said, "You know, Mason, the funny thing about truth is that it doesn't always come when you want it. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. But when it does, it changes everything." I smiled. "Yeah," I said softly. "It does." And as the last light of the day faded, I realized something. I had spent so long trying to prove myself, to earn love, to be someone in Richard's world. But now I didn't need any of that, because I finally knew who I was. Not Richard's son, not a mistake, not nothing. I was Mason, and that was enough.